So the original plan for this month was to talk about my approach to covering indie games and how I'm not sure it's working and how I wanted to experiment with some new formats. And I had this whole long speech prepared to explain that idea with a few examples. And then I spent the month of November hopping from AAA game to AAA game because, well, I'm a bad planner and because the holidays is still the big video game blockbuster season. So with no indie footage, but plenty of the first few hours of several AAA titles sitting around, I'm going to release a few, what I'm going to call Thanksgiving leftover episodes, where I talk very briefly about all the AAA games I've been bouncing between, but for the record, have in no way completed. The more introspective indie thing is still coming, but maybe this delayed feast of random points will tide you over until then. So let's start with... In most ways, Battlefield 5 is fine. It's Battlefield. You shoot some guys, and they shoot you, and sometimes the tank blows you up, and sometimes you blow up a tank. Once in a blue moon, you might actually get to drive a tank. At its heart, it's a goofy war game that emphasizes creating memorable stories on the battlefield. That time I blew up a tank and took on a whole squad all by myself.
Grenade out! Placing charges!
That time a blast blew up right overhead and I was dodging the debris of falling ruins as I dodged bullets. That time I and a teammate were both shot dead and I watched as the medic chose the other player instead of me to heal, and all I could do was plead with the left mouse button for medical attention, but it was too late.
Help me, someone! You gotta help me!
It might be 20 boring humdrum spawn and die video game lives for every memorable one, but the times it comes together to make a memorable event, there's really nothing else like it out there. The wacky emergent storytelling and action movie drama is the bread and butter of Battlefield. It always has been. And this game is, well, it's more of that, for good and for ill. So why did they start the single-player campaign, and indeed I believe the whole game, with perhaps the most pretentious opening for a war game I've ever seen? And you know when I'm calling something pretentious, there's probably a problem. You know how obnoxious those quotes in Call of Duty are when you die? Like you got shot and teabagged by Big Dog 420, and the game decides that Winston Churchill's quote, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed to so many by so few," was appropriate to display over that? This feels like a video game intro made entirely out of that material. Like, here is, I think, the part where they completely lost me.
Until you've pulled the trigger on an enemy, you're not ready for war. You're only ready to die.
So you're in a final stand, Saving Private Ryan scenario, facing off against enemies with literal red triangles above their heads to indicate that they're the bad guys. And the game has the audacity to suggest that if you haven't actually pulled the trigger to kill someone, you're not ready for war, you're just ready to die. Then, blam, play maudlin Hobbit music and cut to majestic landscapes. It's just so self-serious for the game it's selling. And again, this is before you get into any menu. This is before you play the multiplayer fun times. They make you see this. And to be clear, if the game wanted to cover war seriously, great. Valiant Hearts may have wobbly bits that don't work as well and are kind of cartoony, but it was an earnest attempt to humanize the loss of life and innocence among the soldiers of World War I. Or This War of Mine, a game interested less in the stories of soldiers, but in the civilians trapped by conflict. Games can totally do this material justice, but they need to be built around the idea that that's what they're exploring. You can't just put a mawkish soundtrack over some profound quotes about the terrors of war, have a few scripted sequences where the player dies to sell them on the horror and violence of conflict, then scoot people over to a 32-on-32 battle with their friends where they can unlock totally cool new face paints of epic rarity and let them express themselves with radical paint jobs for their sniper rifle. There's something disingenuous about that game opening with a statement about how if you haven't held a gun to someone's head, you're not really ready for war. And for the record, the actual single-player game itself isn't nearly that bad. It tries to branch out to stories maybe less heard about in World War II. A criminal kid that gets taken in to become a member of the SBS that would eventually become the ancestor of modern special forces units. A story about the Senegalese tirailleurs and their desire to be respected by their fellow soldiers. And the tale of a resistance movement not in Vichy France, but in Norway. And they have this kinda underdeveloped thematic through line of family.
Always searching. Sometimes finding. Brothers. Sons and daughters. Mothers and fathers. We have no world without them.
A surrogate father-son thing in Billy Bridger's story, a brothers thing in the Tirailleurs story, and a mother-daughter story in the Norway tale. And for what they are, little vignettes to pad out a multiplayer game in order to sell this $60 title as a quote-unquote complete package, they're really well written and directed. Probably too much so, really. Their reach doesn't exceed the grasp of their creators, but rather the format they're in. Billy gets to deal with his daddy issues and learn people won't always abandon him, and the French forces go from treating the Senegalese tirailleurs like crap and forcing them to dig latrines, to the end where they're patting them on the back for their accomplishments. But these things happen in the span of like an hour and a half of gameplay and 3 or so levels for each story. As a result, they don't feel like epic war stories or war movies, they feel like little parables, which doesn't match with the grand scope of either their thematics or tone. I like the stories they're trying to tell, stories from the less heard of corners of the war, driven by strongly motivated, well-written characters that have thematic through lines, not just in the individual stories, but also as a whole. Taken on their own, they're actually pretty great little video game short stories.
Quand l'armée française a libéré Paris, ils ont retiré tous les soldats noirs. Ils les ont remplacés par des visages plus familiers. Mais moi, je sais ce qu'on a fait. Et à quel prix. Et j'en suis fier.
But this does not feel like the format or platform to be telling them, because all of these war is hell and loss, find, hold on to, and defend family where you can stories are set next to a big sandbox multiplayer game asking you to earn fake currency by killing bad guys so that you can paint your gun fancy and show it off to your friends. And as long as I'm just nitpicking the game, here's a really shallow complaint on my part. I don't like that DICE have kept the handheld camera aesthetics and hyper-realistic visual style that originated in Battlefield 3 and 4. Look at how dirty the camera lens is in this shot, or the various lens flares throughout the entirety of the game. These wouldn't be accidental in a film, and they're absolutely not accidental in a digital medium where the camera lens doesn't exist. It's using cinematic techniques that are distinctly a reflection of a more modern sensibility to sell us on a 1940s world, and I'm not sure it works. I'll be honest, outside of the gun models, I have a hard time telling this game from Battlefield 1 in screenshots, and outside of the UI design from Battlefield 3 and 4. Battlefield has gorgeous landscapes, but no sense of place or time, especially given the scale of the battles means that you're never up close to any technology or people or clothing or anything that gives it a real sense of, hey, this is World War II. Heck, if you put aside the lightsabers and droids and all of that stuff, the desert scenes in Battlefield 5 really don't look that different from the Tatooine levels in Battlefront. That's not necessarily an insult, they're gorgeous, but aesthetically they're all going for the same hyper-real thing, and I wish it had more of a visual identity than look at these lens flares in the middle of this photorealistic landscape. When I heard that Battlefield was returning to World War II, I was expecting something a little bit more pulpy. Battlefield 1942 had this sort of Indiana Jones feel to it, a take on World War II that had more to do with romanticized images of a war that was seen, certainly at the time, as morally uncomplicated, because you were fighting Nazis. And yeah, a pulpy, fun take on the most deadly war in history has its own problematic aspects, especially when, again, this is a real event that happened and millions upon millions of people died. But if you're stuck with a game format that's about playing soldiers and making memorable fun times on the front lines anyway, maybe a goofier, more fun tone is what you want. Maybe Battlefield isn't a game that needs to be about overcoming racism and reuniting families and dealing with daddy issues with verisimilitudinous camera lens rendering tech. Maybe it can, and arguably should, just be a fun game where shooting a tank in the butt with a rocket is really satisfying to watch the explosions of.